Nick mentioned, here I'm as a affiliate researcher with the MCTD, Mindru Center for Technology and Democracy within the University of Cambridge. Oops. Is it? Is it? Okay, it's moving. Yeah. And I'm here to present our research, and I must mention my co-authors who unfortunately couldn't be here. So there's me, and then there's Sinye Kosman, who is a doctoral research fellow, and then Dr. Timothy Sharton, who is a research associate postdoc at the center. And all of us collaborate together initially on humanitarian action program at the Mindru Center for Technology and Democracy. And this paper was also born from one of our initial inquiries on humanitarian digital infrastructure. And very happy to talk about that further as well. Yeah, but want to start with stacks, which is the gist of this paper. So historically, stacks, when we talk about it, they were technical artifacts across the technical systems, right? And then that's what this little pictures there is. One is showing that Facebook is updating or has a new tech stack where we know okay, it was a PHP, now Hack, and that famously Facebook is built on PHP, and React, which is their JavaScript library, also very well known, and then there's Cassandra, Hadoop, and such. And then the other picture is from the CNCF, which is called Landscape, that's what they call, and then which shows many different products or services, for okay, here's the database of the CNCF members, CI/CD pipeline, for orchestration, these are the products, service mesh, key management, and so on and so forth. By the way, fun fact, speaking of stacks, this is what's inspiring Deutschland Stack's tech stack Landkarte, tech stack's map later, where they're referencing. So that's interesting. But what we are seeing is that from 2020s, the states have begun treating this entire digital ecosystem as stacks. And then this is what we, oops. Yeah. So here, the gist of the paper, from technical stacks to power stacks, where stacks are no longer just technical artifacts from the architecture and such. And then when we ask about stacks, often in a tech company, people would say oh, our first tech lead was really into Golang over Python, so that's why this was happened to be built on that. And then sometimes it does have some deliberate calculation, we chose this because it's cheap, many people in our company knew this, but a lot of times we thought this was rather not thought through always, about the future proofing. But what we are seeing is that when it comes to what we are seeing is that now stacks include governance, procurement, policy, standards, funding, and many other things. It went from a technical artifact to rather socio-political artifact. And what we are also seeing is that this bundles of technology stacks or platforms, this all together provide public digital services and applications at the nation state level, which Ramya also referred to, digital public infrastructure that's made up of stacked modular components, sometimes open, closed, open software standards, models, and such. And then now we are seeing the stacks being applied in a digital sovereignty discourse. And because open source is such a fundamental component of any modern technology, this doesn't also escape like open source as well, of course. So here, what we are seeing is that open digital ecosystem that's also being governed, steered, and curated by many different actors. And then with like digital sovereignty as the main driver. And then these are just like different, very recent clippings. ICC, which Jennifer mentioned, that it said that the chief prosecutor, like Kamrin Khan, after being hit by the sanctions from the current U.S. administration, was said to be disconnected from his email services, which is Microsoft Outlook. And many thought that this was like thought to be the Microsoft supporting the U.S. sanctions, although the Microsoft, the firm denies that, like we did not do that. And then another is a clipping from a LinkedIn post made by Markus Richter, who is a state secretary at the newly formed ministry, BMDS, Bundesministerium für Digitales und Staatsmodernisierung, where he is referring to the meeting that he had with Joshua Bengio, and then like how this meeting reaffirmed their design or ideation for the Deutschland stack, what it would be like. And then other like Jiun from the 2024 exit, like utils backdoor, the Trojan horse, and then which is suspected to be a nation state-backed hacker. And then last but not least, it's a 2019 article from GitHub, like blocking access to certain users from certain regions. And yeah, so with that, like we see the changing rhetoric of open source. So initially, especially like until I would say like early 2020s, like open source as freedom, and like of course the for freedom. And then that was like originally anchored very much in like community, like autonomy, collaboration. That's how we saw this like referred to. And at least, and in many countries or governments, like we started seeing like OSPOs as civic infrastructure, and then we saw a lot of code for so-and-so, like code for America, code for Germany, code for Romania, like many of this initiative that had become much larger in many different contexts. And then and then after that, we started seeing the open source as critical infrastructure. And then that, of course, like come from some of the major open source supply chain like breaches, like the Log4j and many other that made many people like wake up. And then that started have the governments frame open source as a critical infrastructure. And then, as some of the previous presenters mentioned, like a number of frameworks, directives, and acts came out, like from the various governments. Some of them, like SSDF, NIS, like Directive, and Cyber Resilience Act, CRA, from the European Union, starting from like 2020s, I would say. And then the last but not least is open source as sovereignty. So states like start to adopt open source like precisely as a control mechanism. Sometimes they fork it, sometimes they enclose it, securitize it, or build like national variants. So that's some of the like changing rhetorics of open source we see. And of course, it's not always like moving from like one another. There's a lot of overlaps. So it's a hyper generalization, but more or less like this is what we are seeing. Oops. Okay, somehow it skipped like multiple slides and it almost gave me a heart attack. And then we see like different variations and flavors of digital sovereignty. And then this is a hyper generalization, of course, but I really invite everyone to read at least the appendix, like table on our paper, which does compare different stacks, like the ones beyond that's mentioned here, like India stack, Euro stack, China's DSR, as well as pooled fund like GovStack. And then some like mentioned, we also look at US like big tech. They're not like referred as stacks, but we do look at who is financing this, like what's the internationalization mechanism, like and such. So what we are seeing is that the EU frames like sovereignty through value and a lot of risk-based and like legislative control. And the US, honestly, is this being recorded? I struggled quite a lot. Like, okay, I struggled like putting this together because a lot seem to have changed since the new like administration in the United States. Like more or less, like I see people nodding and like shaking heads, um, and so it's like what is it like until there was a big work on supply chain control part always like open source securitization from like NIST and such. And then there was always sanctions, and then bit about like security part, but wasn't. Yeah, I struggled. And then India, open standards and like very diplomatically and export of digital public infrastructure. And then I thought this quote from Modi was very interesting, just from last month, about how this is not just like digital aid, but it's a digital empowerment. And then China, like there's a bit of emphasis on self-reliance and jurisdictional control, and then the domesticated stacks, which Jan also mentioned in his research earlier, so was very excited to see that. And then so to develop our argument, like we borrowed deliberately from curatorial practice in the arts. So I am not a curator, but just someone who really loves museums and have many friends that are artists and work in museums. So, and then also who are curators and of content in like large content-driven tech platforms. So that's where much of the inspiration had come from, and then also a lot of education. So I read like some of two canons of like curatorial practice. One was by Hans-Uli Obrich, the Brief History of Curating, and then Paul O'Neill, like the curatorial turn, practice to discourse. And then all of it, what it says is it's not neutral. It involves like a very careful and intentional selecting, care, preservation, contextualization, and then narrative construction of artifacts or art, like for the certain setting. So when like we think of infrastructure through like curatorial lens, like we started to see that this open source components or projects or apps or whichever was like kind of curated very similarly as well, that they were selected, configured, and like framed to produce specific outcomes and sort of experience for the user. As in like for the museum goers, like how they sort of design the museum goers experience. Like we want someone to be in this space looking at these artifacts and then get out thinking or having learned or having these artifacts evocated like a certain emotion or certain like feeling or certain like new thoughts. So this is how we define like stack curation, that this is a very selective integration, configuration, and governance of open source components to serve certain like agendas, like national or institutional agendas. And then this like curation manifests in like many different mechanisms. So first, like selection of aligned components or like repository, like and then that could be based on many different criteria. And then sometimes that's just like selected, as in like this is something that we're going to put in our portfolio, or sometimes it's just done through like forking, and then the original project like remains. And then or sometimes through modification. And then there is integration, which is the centralized standard or norm setting. And then we will get into the curatorial, like the modalities or the typology. And sometimes like it's framing, like, oh, this is this because this is a sovereign cloud for XYZ like region. We selected this because it reflects like a citizen's data access to do this. But then like I always had question, there's million projects that does that. Like, so why is like CCAN selected for this country? Like, how did you do that? Like, because there's many comparable projects, like in my opinion, sometimes. And then after it's like application of governance, like often through the financing, strategic financing, and sometimes through like ODA, overseas development assistance channels. And then the last but not least, like circulation, that's like done, some examples being like supply chain, the intervention, and then sometimes through export control, as in circulation, as in who gets to use this, who don't get to use this. So that's the typology of stack curation, like which has the modality, dimensions, mechanisms, and examples. But I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I will go through this very quick. So it does have 6 different like typology, and then like we have selection, which is the curator selecting aligned technologies. And then framing, this is a branding or like attaching narrative to like certain component in their stack as like sovereign, open, secure, like citizen-centric and such. And canonization, that's turning certain component into the global reference model. And then dependence, this is like institutionalizing long-term technical reliance. And sometimes like stacks are chosen based on dependence, or sometimes they are chosen to create the dependence. And then gatekeeping, that's regulating contribution and participation. And then the last is, which includes like sanctions and then export control and such. And this is such an interesting thing to be looked at, and something I spent a bit of time in the paper about the ECCN, like EAR. Very quick, according to like the US government like sanctions, Office of Foreign Asset Control, like open source is exempt. But then like it does say that in the export controlled items, the dual use technologies are like not part of that, even though it's open source. But then like how do you define a dual use? And they defined it quite like closely, quite well, which like one of them being like encryption. Like if it does have encryption capacity, then it is a dual use. So I started like looking at, so what do you mean? Like, isn't this like a lot of modern technology? And then, for example, like Python, the programming language is listed there. So it's like, okay, if I have an open source project, if it's like written in Python to some degree, then this is like an export controlled item. Like, for example, yeah, and then, like just, yeah, like one background is I've learned this hard way. Like not as a researcher, but as a practitioner that was trying to use like this open source project when I worked as an aid worker in like sanctioned governments. So, so I learned it hard way with a lot of inquiries with like legal professionals. Like, so is it this? Is it that? How do I write the Office of Asset Control like application? And then the last is the domestication. Have 2 case studies. Like one is with Gitee, but I see Nick with signaling, so I'll actually just go to the second case study, which is PEPFAR and DHIS2. And then just because the Chinese the policy has been mentioned by other colleagues like previously. So quick, PEPFAR is announced by the President George W. Bush, the junior, and then it's the President Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. And then it is the largest commitment by any nation to address a single disease. And then it initially started with like 15 billion over 5 years, like 2003-ish. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, sorry everyone. Yes, PEPFAR. And then initially, it was just 15 high-burden countries, and then it scaled quite rapidly in 2008. Like, so the budget expanded to 48 billion with the And then in 2010, it became even bigger for two reasons. One was the scientific breakthrough on HPTN like 052, the clinical trials, and the second was that there was a collaboration with the Global Fund, which is the pooled fund started and got much bigger around that time. That's a public-private partnership born from like G8 summit to tackle like AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. So it got much bigger, and then right now it's under review, like many other international development programs, like in the United States. But it's still operating and under like updated U.S. congressional authorization, and then it's still the largest global health program out there. And then there's this thing called DHIS2. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It's initially developed by University of Oslo. It's a district health information system. And then initially, like in 1996, like this was meant for 2 districts in South Africa, and then after it was in India, and 2010-11 was Kenya, and that was like until for like about like little less than 10 years, it was like 3-country implementation, not like the largest, like not the big program that it is now. And in 2013, the Norwegian government, the USAID equivalent of the Norwegian government, NORAD, and PEPFAR and the Global Fund made a big commitment to support the DHIS2 development. And then with that, now it is used in 130 plus countries. And this is quite interesting. And then DHIS2 is an open source platform that's with like many modular components as well. But what we have seen is that PEPFAR supported countries and like implementing partners are often like leveraging DHIS2 as the national or like sub-national, like so state level HIV program data management and reporting and analysis. And then also important to mention that like PEPFAR at that time was like very indicator heavy program with like a very frequent reporting frequency, as in this was one of the first programs to look at like data, or we make a data-driven decision in international development and like global health program. So to get that data, you have to really go for like frequent reporting and then a lot of granular indicators as well. So how this PEPFAR reporting architecture was designed was that data is supposed to flow through based on a quarterly monitoring evaluation research indicator that's on like DATIM, which was like open source but centrally managed by the coordinator of AIDS like office in the US government. And then this was like what was used for the country operation plans and the regional operation plan, and then also this is to inform performance management and target setting, and most importantly, subsequent funding decisions from the US government to the recipient government often, or what they call partner government. So this enabled PEPFAR to monitor like global program data with a single architecture. And then it's like really anchoring the partner government's performance management and financial accountability mechanisms there. And then what had this resulted, like, and this was all like open source thing, and then it's still there, was that it's technically open infrastructure, but like institutionally closed. That was like very much governed by donor-driven reporting and then like funding rhythms. And then also what ended up happening was a lot of partner governments. It was when they were also setting up electronic health information system for the first time. So of course, like to make the reporting bit easier, a lot of indicators were adopted as well. A lot of the funder-driven indicator. And then this is like what and then there was a bit of discussion on the indicator gravity, which is pulling from the National Health Information System towards the donor-defined metrics and performance framework. And then there's a lot of debate on like, isn't this like shaping this whole intervention around like funder priorities rather than like the local needs or the partner countries' needs or the data that's actually interesting for them versus like the funder. So that's one. And then there's more like concerns around like data sovereignty, ownership, control as well. So since we didn't cover Gitee, I'll just like skip to this. Yeah. So it's still an ongoing research. And then this leads to 3 key implications for the open source ecosystem. That like one is that open source is a geopolitical infrastructure, and then dependencies are political. It's not just technical. And then third, this was what we are spending time, like top-down curation can be resisted, and communities already do so. And then for this, in the paper, we do refer to like Nix community, like resisting Anduril, utilizing Nix, and then who do we accept contributions from as a community? Like, do we say no to defense actors and such? So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. And thank you for timekeeping, Nick.